Hey everyone, welcome to the lecture video on Friedrich Nietzsche. But before I get into his ideas proper, let me just say a few words about existentialism, which is kind of the more broad category we're studying in this last chapter in the Reader. And existentialism was a movement in the kind of, some people would argue, had its roots in the 1800s, but in the early part of the 20th century, it really took off, in particular in Europe and countries like France and Germany. And existentialism is a movement or sort of philosophy that focuses on the freedom of the individual. Not just the responsibility, but kind of the fun and the enjoyment of life on the individual as well. It is often associated with views that deny the existence of God or see God as sort of something of the past and sort of see a new human existence where we don't have ties or connections to God. It's often connected with that. And indeed, Friedrich Nietzsche is going to make that argument. He was one of the first ones to do so in the West. But it should be known, it should be pointed out, that existentialism does not have to be that way. Existentialism can be from a religious perspective as well. So, for instance, I cite Søren Kierkegaard, a famous Christian existentialist, who kind of said he came up with the idea of a leap of faith. He said that the leap of faith in God is very personal, and he emphasized the personal element, that a person leaps into the arms of God, so to speak, knowing that there aren't necessarily enough reasons or evidence, and that's kind of part of what makes it that important. But it's a very individual leap. So he's often labeled as an existentialist. So existentialists focus on individual freedom, individual responsibility, and sort of living one's own life. But they can come from different perspectives. Existentialists come from different angles. And after Nietzsche, we'll look at Simone de Beauvoir, who's a French existentialist who's famous for being one of the first female philosophers to actually philosophize about females and about women and about oppression. And she was certainly a contributor to the second wave of feminism. And we'll look at her next time. But she also has existentialist ideas. So one other thing I'd say about existentialism is that it's pro-individual and anti-power, anti-structure. So it's kind of trying to move us away from doing things just because they're a tradition, or believing things, just because our parents believe them or they've been believed by the society for many years. It kind of, again, it puts the focus on individuals, but it also takes us away, it pushes us away from structures and systems and things like that. And in relation to Simone de Beauvoir, that's why she's able to kind of look at the system of male dominance as a whole and say, hey guys, there's really a problem here. We have this systemic issue for many, many years of male dominance and discrimination, ultimately, which, its recent fruition was the #MeToo movement, which we may or may not discuss on the discussion board once we get to Simone de Beauvoir. But anyways, that is just a brief introduction to existentialism. Now, actually, there's one other thing that I would add that I think summarizes existentialism, and that's that, going back to Aristotle, humans are usually said to have some higher level of moral ability, some higher level of the ability to think morally or reason morally. And let me put it this way. A dog doesn't know why he does right or wrong, right? If the dog jumps on the table and eats the food, you might get mad at the dog, but you don't deeply blame him for doing it. Whereas if your son does that and just jumps onto someone's plate and takes their food, you say, hey, don't do that. And you can teach your son that that's the wrong action. So humans are capable of being reasoned in and out of moral positions. We also have things like, some would argue, things like conscience, a sense that we did something right or wrong. And people like Aristotle would argue that animals don't possess that. So Aristotle, recall, said we have a rational soul. And one of the central features of that soul is moral ability, the ability to reason. Plato said a similar thing, that sort of our higher capacities as humans gives us the ability to reason about many things, including what's morally right, what the best society is, and so forth. So the essence is that we have this kind of, as humans, this higher capacity for reason, one could argue. But then again, where does that come from? Where do we get that ability to reason? Why do we have it? Is it just part of human nature? Well, for many years in the Western world, we believed that it was connected deeply with God. That the reason why we, where did we get conscience, for instance? Some would say, well, that's God's way of making us know what's right and wrong. He built conscience into our mind. So, for many years in the West, morality and God have been deeply connected and linked. And in fact, people who don't believe, for many years would have sometimes been killed, and certainly were killed, excommunicated, pushed out of the society. The idea is that you're not a good person unless you believe in God, because God gives you these moral values. He gives you something to follow. So now, what's happening in the early part of the 20th century, especially with some of these existentialists like Nietzsche, is they're losing their belief in God. And people around the culture, and even to this day, belief in God, if you look statistically at like Pew Research, it's gradually declining. Now, I mean, there's different variables along which we can trace those statistics, but generally speaking, it's declining. So, in the early part of the 20th century, you have fewer people believing in God, and this existentialist movement is picking up. And so what happens if you had God and morality were connected for so many years, and God goes away? God's the foundation for all of it, right? So everything comes crashing down, kind of like pulling out the Jenga thing, and the Jenga puzzle comes crashing down. That God is like that central piece holding together our morals. When you take it away, what happens? Well, all hell breaks loose, some would argue. And some see that as a really bad thing, but Nietzsche and others see it as a really good thing, because they think that it's been a false connection between God and morality. They think that it's BS, and they think that, moreover, we can create our own morality, that puts the responsibility on us. So just giving you another example of how existentialists see the responsibility of life's creation, of what is right and wrong, falling squarely on humans, and not on some higher entity. Usually, like I said, there's some Christians who are existentialists, but in that regard, the existentialists, especially in the early part of the 20th century, were sort of disconnecting God from morality, and then because the Jenga thing falls down, that leaves us to fend for ourselves. And that's kind of the starting point of existentialism for a lot of existentialists, is that, hey, I'm in this world just kind of thrown in. What do I do now? What am I supposed to do? Right? I don't have any more guidance from previous belief systems. Where do I go on my own? So anyways, that's a bit of an overview of existentialism. So let's look at Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, his perhaps most famous idea is the death of God. And you could probably see hints of that in what I was just describing. So he, of course, doesn't believe God actually died. He's referring to the death of an idea. And he thinks the idea of God has been sort of chipped away through new scientific advances ever since the scientific revolution, with people like Hume and Descartes. He thinks ever since then, ever since those guys have been reminding us to look at the world and to study it, and especially people like Hume, who were empiricists, and we've been discovering new laws and facts about nature, Nietzsche believes that that's gradually, though very subtly, we may not even realize it, but it's eroding our need to believe in God, he thinks. And then Nietzsche believes that what this leads us to when God isn't there, when the Jenga puzzle falls down, we are left with no meaning. And the term nihilism is the idea that there is no meaning to life. Nihilism often comes as a feeling, right? This sense of purposelessness. Often after you fail a test or go through a rough breakup or a rough time in your life, you feel a lack of meaning. But nihilism takes it a little further and says, no, life really doesn't have any meaning. There isn't really a point to it. However, for Nietzsche, in Nietzsche's philosophy, he thinks that is actually a good thing. Right? A lot of people would see that as a bad thing, that there's no meaning. that there's no deeply inherent meaning to life, that there's no meaning to life the same way there are laws of physics, right? There's not some deep meaning. But for Nietzsche, that's a blessing, because that means that we can create our own meaning, right? That means, and again, we come back to that central focus of individual creation and development in existentialism. And Nietzsche actually argued that we're at a primitive stage, historically speaking, and he would say today we're still in a similar stage, where we have not evolved intellectually and kind of spiritually, if you will. And he actually predicts that there will be a future evolution of humans where we develop a deeper new understanding of morality, and we throw away the old ways of doing things, and we move on to a new society beyond nihilism. And he calls this kind of stage of humanity the overman, or the German word is the Ubermensch, kind of like the more highly evolved human who has learned anew the ability to create himself, and who has rejected the values of society and of religion and of politics and so forth. And Nietzsche predicts that this overman will be led to a new future society, though he admits he's a prophet here. He doesn't know exactly how things will go. He just sees a trend that we will evolve into this sort of new, more deeply understanding being called the overman. We'll talk about that. And then Nietzsche was actually what's called a philologist, which was somebody who studied ancient texts and religious texts. So he would have spoken a couple languages, like certainly at least been able to read Greek and Latin. And he spent a lot of time poring through texts, including the Bible and Stoic writings and ancient Greek writings. And he notices this trend in morality. And he says that at the beginning of human history, there was this kind of moral systems were based on dominance and power, and he calls that master morality. But he says at the time of the Greeks, that started to be overtaken by reason and temperance and control of one's body and one's desires. And he calls that slave morality, that would later reach its fruition with people like Jesus and Buddha. And so Nietzsche, reading these religious texts that lay out moral systems, he sees a clear sort of pattern of moral behavior. So we'll talk about that later. But underpinning all of Nietzsche's philosophy is this idea of the will to power, which is what it sounds like, except you should understand power very broadly in this example. Power refers not just to physical dominance. It refers to that too, but it can refer to psychological dominance. So when you're at work and a coworker makes a rude passive-aggressive comment, for example, that's a form of power that coworker is trying to have over you. When you are in an argument and you want to be right, and you're arguing your point of view, that's a form of power. And so it's not just physical dominance. When you push for your child to succeed, that's another form of power, because you're pushing your own desires through your child. It's still ultimately, one would argue from this perspective, a selfish, power-based desire. But Nietzsche said that this is not just in humans, it's particularly complex in humans because we're complicated beings. But power exists at the very basic level of nature. I mean, when a plant gradually moves, which we can see with time-lapse photography, when a plant gradually moves into the sunlight, that's a form of power for Nietzsche. When the lion gets the gazelle, that's a form of power. So for Nietzsche, life has to be understood through different struggles for power. Anyways. Okay, so before getting into Nietzsche's ideas in more depth, I do want to mention one other sort of worldview or cultural tradition that was developed partly from Nietzsche's ideas. Now, Nietzsche didn't start this movement, and he would actually disagree with a lot of it. But you'll see how some of his ideas kind of lead to this ultimate to this thing called postmodernism. So postmodernism itself is actually somewhat hard to define. So modernity, or modernity in kind of a historical sense, refers to Enlightenment values from the scientific revolution, values of reason and evidence and things like that. And postmodernism was a sort of response to that idea that reason and evidence was going to solve everything. And postmodernists, rather than believing that there's a concrete truth, believe that there's no truth. So they're basically moral relativists. There's no truth whatsoever. Now, Nietzsche was a relativist in a way, but we'll talk about the way he saw things along those lines. But postmodernism takes it much further. I mean, they sometimes believe that there's nothing that you can ever say that is true. And they often write in very dense, complicated text that some people have criticized for just sounding complex without having any meaning behind it. So that's the criticism of postmodernism, is that it purports to be this really, amazingly deep intellectual movement that is pushing us away from these modern values we had before. At the same time, there's no core principles on which postmodernism is based, because it's kind of anti those principles to begin with. So in a way, just like relativism, some have argued postmodernism is self-defeating. It defeats itself. It says everything's just a system of power that points to something else, and there's no meaning or truth or value. But that means that there's also no meaning or truth or value to postmodernism itself. Hence the idea that it's self-defeating. But anyways, just to take an example from the reader, at the beginning of the Nietzsche chapter, there was a guy when postmodernism was getting big in the late 90s and early 2000s. There were some people who created a postmodernism generator, and I don't think it's out there anymore, but you basically could just put in a few big words and then it would generate a sentence of nonsense that sounded complex but wasn't. And so I have in the reader an actual quote from one of those. And again, at the beginning of the Nietzsche chapter, it says, "If one examines dialectical dematerialism, one is faced with a choice." So first of all, no such thing as dialectical dematerialism. Right? Dialectical materialism is Marx's view. Dematerialism doesn't have a meaning. One is faced with a choice: either reject constructive discourse or conclude that narrative is a product of the masses, given that sexuality is distinct from language. Right now they're just kind of connecting various ideas without any real meaning or logic. It could be said that the subject is interpolated into a dialectic dematerialism that includes truth as a reality. Right? All sounds deep, but it means nothing. Right? It doesn't have any meaning. So this is the criticism that people make of Nietzsche and his the fact that his ideas somewhat push us down this path where there's no truth and there's no value. And so some would argue that's a bad thing. There is a truth, some would argue. There are scientific facts. So anyways, that's another movement that was certainly influenced by Nietzsche's ideas. Okay, so Nietzsche himself, like I said, was a German guy. And something a little bit different about him is that he was very artistic. And he actually wrote in aphorisms, aphorisms are small, punchy, like paragraphs or couple sentence, just passages that give you a central idea or make some point, or give us a little reflection on life. And Nietzsche wrote like that. So some people criticized him for that because philosophers before that, like Plato and Aristotle, were very detailed and specific with how they wrote their arguments out. And Aquinas and others, whereas Nietzsche did it more in an artistic way. Now, to be fair, Nietzsche's ideas are still they're very much present there. He's not writing nonsense by any means. He's not, like I said, he influenced postmodernism. He was not a postmodernist. So we can piece together his beliefs and his philosophy from what he wrote and what he said, but he wrote in a different way. And he ultimately would argue that art and enjoyment of art in life was a great value, a great source of value for humans. Ultimately, remember, he's a nihilist. He doesn't think there's any deep meaning, given by God or something, or in the universe, but he does think that we can create our own value. And so he was, like I said, a huge fan of art, and even wrote some music himself on the piano. He also had the view that we should bring our life into our philosophy, that we should think about, when we think about philosophy, we should think about it in a practical way about our lives. So for instance, he has a phrase that is attached to him called, that says, philosophize with a hammer. In other words, in the same way you would test a brick to see if it's worthy of being, to see if it's strong enough. If you're a construction worker, you might just test the piece of wood by hitting it with a hammer, see if it's strong enough, if it's worthy of being, being a support in the house. Nietzsche says, similarly, we should do that with our beliefs. We should test our beliefs as though they're a piece of wood that's being tested for construction to see if it's worthy of being believed. So in other words, we should apply our philosophy, our beliefs, to scrutiny and to think them through, as he certainly did. Now, Nietzsche had an interesting biography too, because his father was actually a preacher. And correct me if you can't correct me if I'm wrong, but I forgot the exact time it was in his life, but I believe he was pretty young when his father died of some kind of brain tumor or cancer or something like that. And it had a huge impact on him. He may have been 12 or 13 years old, maybe 14 or 15 when his father died. And before that, he had been he was primed to be the next preacher. He was super devout and religious. He was, he'd come into every service ready to go, and it all came crashing down when his father died. He lost his faith, and he would build up the arguments against God that would happen throughout the rest of his life. Now, some of you are going to be tempted to use an ad hominem fallacy against Nietzsche and say, well, see, of course, that's why he was negative in some ways, because he had a bad experience. But remember, that's the ad hominem fallacy. A person's experiences or circumstances don't take away or add to the arguments they're presenting. So we would still want to take Nietzsche's arguments on their own merit rather than just dismiss them because of his life circumstances. It's just like if a doctor tells you not to smoke, but he happens to smoke himself, it doesn't mean his advice to not smoke isn't still sound. It just means he can't control his own desires. So we don't dismiss an idea or argument based on the circumstances of the person. So anyways, but nevertheless, it's interesting to think about what may have led him there and to think about his life. So Nietzsche was influenced by this other German philosopher named Schopenhauer, who came a little bit before him. And Schopenhauer is often labeled not just a nihilist, but a pessimist as well. So if you look a few pages into the beginning of the Reader chapter on Nietzsche, you'll see some quotes right before the Will to Power section, and these are from Schopenhauer. And these quotes really emphasize not just nihilism, but also pessimism. Pessimism means that not only is life meaningless, but it would be better if we weren't here. Life is so bad, it would be better not to have been born. And Schopenhauer seems to have believed that and even argued it for it in some cases. He said life is just needlessly evil and complex, and in a bad way, he thought. So look at these quotes. A man finds himself, to his great astonishment, suddenly existing after thousands and thousands of years of non-existence. He lives for a little while, and then again comes an equally long period of time when he must exist no more. That's the predicament of our life. We come into this life, we know about all this crap that happened before, we learn about all these people, Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha, that came before who influenced us. We also know that we're not going to live that much further in the eyes of the universe. We're going to have a full life, we hope. But in the grand scheme of things, that's nothing. Then we're going to die, and then for Schopenhauer, there's nothing after that. So it's a pretty crazy situation to be in, all for every single human being that is born into this world. And Schopenhauer, with that quote, reminds us of that what we're faced with. So that's why he's a pessimist. And then he says, we are like a man running downhill who cannot keep his feet on unless he runs on, who cannot keep on his feet unless he runs on, and will inevitably fall if he stops. And that really emphasizes the pace of life, that it just seems like one thing after another, and it's hard to even stop to catch a breath. Where's the meaning? Where's the purpose here? Asks Schopenhauer. And then he reflects on boredom. Boredom is a direct proof that existence has no real value in itself. For what is boredom but the feeling of the emptiness of life? In other words, if when we have the time to just sit and just exist, we feel bored, we're not happy with just existing. Does that say something about our predicament too? Doesn't that tell us that this life doesn't have meaning? And then here's the real pessimism in this last quote. Existence is like a drop of water seen through a microscope, a single drop teeming with bacteria, or a speck of cheese full of mites invisible to the naked eye. In other words, existence is nothing, and we're just like a little parasite or a little anthill that's just going to perish once the sun's gone, and we'll be gone. So these are quotes that all emphasize both nihilism and pessimism. And for Schopenhauer, this German philosopher who came before Nietzsche, the answer to life's problems was, he actually argued for Buddhism. He actually said that animals have it the best. They're in the present moment all the time. And that's what Buddhists argue. They argue to meditate and to be in the present moment, to ignore the terrors of life, the dukkha, the suffering, so to speak. And so Schopenhauer actually had read some Buddhist texts and supported Buddhism. But something else he argued is that he argued for art like Nietzsche would do later. And Schopenhauer said art is an improvement upon life, right? It's actually better than life. And that's where we can find our own meaning, if we're going to find it anywhere, is in our own pursuits of meaning, our own pursuits of art. So for example, if you're faced between experiencing the Van Gogh painting of the sunflowers on the left there, versus actually going out and experiencing real sunflowers, Schopenhauer would say it's the painting, because the painting adds an additional vision to reality. It takes away the harshness of reality. It adds something additional that the artist put into it. So art is better than life, and it's the only thing for Schopenhauer that gives life any semblance of meaning or purpose. So this guy was influential in Nietzsche. He also had an idea he called the world as the will. The world was sort of blind will, that Nietzsche would argue, that Nietzsche would use in his argument for the will to power, as we'll see. Which let's get to now. So Nietzsche says that running through everything, at the base of all our ideas, all our beliefs, is this desire for power. At the base of all life, right, not just human life, is the desire for power. So you can see in the picture there on the left, the grass growing through the cement, and at the basic level, that is the will to power. You have the house owner who's spraying the weed killer. He's trying to assert his power over the grass and keep his sidewalk clear, but then the grass keeps growing through if the owner doesn't come back in time. So that's a struggle for power in Nietzsche's view. My father lived in Africa for a couple years, and he told me a story once about being in the Gabonese jungle. Gabon is a country kind of in central Western Africa, right smack in the middle of the rainforest. And my dad said he was kind of going from one place to another in a caravan of sorts through the jungle, and they saw this old hotel that had been built by French settlers probably 50, 60 years ago from the time he was there, which was like 50 years ago now. And it was basically just the frame of the hotel that they saw. It was kind of the whole frame was curved, and it was being sucked back into the jungle. There were vines going in the windows. You could still see the frame, though. And probably today it's been completely taken over by the jungle. And I always thought that as an example of Nietzsche's primitive idea of the will to power. That's just this sheer force of nature just coming in and taking the hotel. Right, the French settlers tried to come in and take some power away from the jungle, and the jungle took it right back to the earth. So that's the will to power. Like I said before, the will to power is also just basic animal dominance. Just when the alpha male gets taken down by one of the other apes in the group, and now you have a new alpha male. That's a struggle for power. When a person when people are involved in a love triangle or quarrel, or two people are interested in the same person. There's a struggle for power there of who's going to get or possess that person. So you can see this is sort of a cynical way of looking at things. But Nietzsche nevertheless believed that all life is driven by this force, this power. Now in humans is where it gets sticky, because it's easy to see the power of the lion taking down the gazelle, right? Or the elephant stampeding over some other smaller animal, or the dominant alpha male taking down the beta male. It's easy to see that. But what about in really subtle cases? Like, what about in cases of people who claim to be compassionate and seem to, they donate to charities and they are known to be spiritual individuals, somebody like the Dalai Lama? Nietzsche would say that even in those cases, there is some raw desire for power at the base of that, right? So for the Dalai Lama, it might be a psychological gain that he gets if you convert to Buddhism. The psychological gain he gets if you're practicing things that he believes are good, like meditation or following the Four Noble Truths. The Dalai Lama, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of a famous Tibetan Buddhist leader. So Nietzsche would see him as kind of having a more subtle desire for power, a more subtle way of gaining power. So in humans, it's not as easy to detect. Let's take a university. Right? Universities are supposed to be after the truth. Universities are supposed to, many would argue, we talked about that difference with Marx between social justice and truth, but one could say that at least one central function of a university is to figure out how the world works, is to find the truth. And yet, what do you find? You find sometimes people pursuing ego or glory. Somebody is curing cancer, Nietzsche would say, they're trying to cure cancer, not because they actually want to find the cure and help people, but because they want to be known as the one who cured cancer, right? They want that to be on their Wikipedia profile that says, this person cured cancer. So everything for Nietzsche has a silver lining. Everybody always wants something from you for Nietzsche, and that something is a little bit of power over you, right? They want you for another purpose. But the crucial thing to see is that you also want this power. It's not just other people over you, it's you over other people. So life is just this game of people subtly taking power back from other people. It's interesting to think about this in the context of sexual harassment and the hashtag #MeToo movement, which again we'll discuss next time when we discuss Simone de Beauvoir. But lots of people have argued in that movement that there are different power structures and differentials at play here. And a really interesting question there is, how much power do women have over men versus men having over women in those contexts? So anyways, Nietzsche sees power everywhere. What about philosophers? If anybody, we're supposed to be the ones after truth, right? Philosophers are supposed to be the ones that want to find the best argument and use reason and not use fallacies and biases and so forth. Well, Nietzsche would say, yeah, but you're just doing that so you can be right. Like, you don't really want the truth. You just want to be the one who's the most clever in the room. You want to be the one who has the most clever argument. You want to be the one where everyone goes, oh, wow, how smart is he? You don't really care about the truth. You just want to sound clever, right? You want to use philosophy to advance your own power. So you can see that Nietzsche didn't really leave anyone alone here. I hope it's obvious that Nietzsche would say religions have been seeking power since the beginning. In subtle ways. I mean, when the guy comes to your door to offer you, to say, hey, will you join my religion? Do you think that's because he really cares about your soul, or really, is that out of the kindness of his heart? I mean, he wants you to join the church so that he gets more followers and supporters. So power isn't just in terms of money. I mean, it can just be in terms of support, of ultimately people agreeing with you, right? There's some power in agreement. You can see that in a room full of people in a classroom where when somebody makes an argument and the rest of the class seems to agree with them, they feel there seems to be a deeper sense of being at peace there, right? That, oh, they agree with me. So there's power in that. There's power in controlling other people and in getting their opinions to agree with yours. sometimes people don't see that about the will to power. They say, oh, well, I just want my son to do well. What gain could I possibly have here? And the gain is psychological. You can say, well, you want your son to do well because that reflects well on you, right? There's still a psychological gain. That is a type of power for Nietzsche. Now, the reason I have servants on there, on that slide, is because sometimes people will say, well, wait a minute, not everybody wants power. Right? Aren't there people who are peaceful by nature and they just kind of want to do their thing? They don't want to be bothered. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to be in charge. Aren't there people who are like that and they don't want power? Well, Nietzsche would again remind us that the will to power is subtle. And he would say that person is seeking power in his own way. And also, if you gave him the chance to have more power, he would take it instantly. Right? If you said, oh, hey, here's a town to run, you're now the mayor, that person would instantly jump on that power. Even if they were skeptical at first, they would see the path to power and take it. At least according to Nietzsche, right? Everybody wants some sort of dominance, some sort of power over another. And notice that even somebody who actually shuts themselves off from society and says, you know what, I'm rejecting everything, I don't want anything to do with their power structure or anything. That in itself, that rejection, that act of rejecting society, that's a form of power. Right? That's a form of saying that I'm better than them, I'm better than this society, I don't need them, I can, I'm gonna secede from the United States and start my own community in the woods. Right? That itself is a form of power. That's not a rejection of power. That's a rejection of one type of power in exchange for a new type that you're, in that example, taking. So for Nietzsche, it's all a struggle for dominance. All life can be seen through this lens. The last thing I'll mention here is, I think it's in the book in a couple places, this idea of virtue signaling. So this is a recent addition to our vernacular in the academic world, and there are some people who don't like the term. I still think it's useful. But virtue signaling is basically when remember, virtue means that a positive character trait. So virtue signaling means you're signaling to others that you're virtuous, that you're good. You want to show other people that you're good. Not because you want to help somebody and be good, but you want to do it so that you'll gain status or you'll gain something from others. You'll gain that psychological benefit. And a great example of this is, Facebook and Instagram and social media posts. Where people will post all this stuff about, oh, it's so terrible, the 1% has all our money, but all they're doing is just copying a meme that's going around, and just reposting it. And they're not doing anything to stop the 1%. They're not doing anything to support the message that they're putting out there. And certainly many of us are guilty of this on social media. That type of virtue signaling speaks to the will to power, because when we signal our virtue to others, we're gaining some degree of power for others believing that we're virtuous. Okay, so anyways, for Nietzsche, this is all the baseline, the substratum, if you will, of life, of existence for living organic beings. You want power. Right? It's not just selfishness, right? It's not just that I want to be the best. It's I want to be the best and I want to push you down while I do it. It's a rise to the top, making sure you're the only one at the top. That's the struggle of life for Nietzsche, and that's the thing through which all his philosophy should be understood. Related to that, to this will to power idea, another sort of major condition of life is the lack of meaning that I was referring to before, nihilism. Now, Nietzsche's vision of nihilism has an addition to it, because he believes that life does not have any meaning, because he doesn't think that there's a God to give it that meaning. He thinks that idea of God is sliding away. But he thinks that because of this allows us to adopt different frameworks, different perspectives as to how we see the world. So different glasses, if you will. For a couple of years, I'll reject my parents' religious values and put on my atheist goggles, and I see the world now through atheism, and I identify with it. But then that doesn't work for me, so I take off my atheist goggles and I become a Buddhist for a couple of years. And then that doesn't work for me, so I say, you know what, I'm going to put my Christian goggles on again. And then I say, you know what, I was wrong. Christianity is what is right for me, or whatever it happens to be. So for Nietzsche, life has no meaning, but we experiment with different frameworks that bring us to different ways of seeing things. But crucially, and Nietzsche was a relativist in this way, a moral relativist, there's no ultimate perspective. There's no perspective that's ultimately true or right. It's just a perspective based on the glasses or goggles we're putting on. The instant that I put on those glasses that make me see the world through Christianity, I now start to believe that that world is objective, that those values are actually true. But Nietzsche would say they're not actually objective. They're just true because you put those glasses on and you're seeing the world through that framework. And the same would be true for any religion or political belief system. Right? And it doesn't have to be a religion. It could just be you become a diehard liberal fanatic or conservative fanatic politically, or libertarian fanatic. You jump into that frame of seeing things, and now you're seeing the whole world through that framework. But again, beneath it all is nothing. There's no meaning beneath it. The meaning comes in once we get in that frame of reference. Right? So it's only meaningful with respect to that frame of reference. So that's why it's a type of relativism, because the meaning is relative to the perspective that we choose to take. Deeply, there's no meaning for Nietzsche. So right and wrong then are relative for Nietzsche. Right and wrong conceived in any way, whether we're saying the right political system or the right moral behavior, it's all relative for Nietzsche. And we experiment with these perspectives. So the error for Nietzsche thinks it's good that we experiment, because he'll argue later that that's what brings us into the overman, to the sort of advancement of humans to the next stage. It's good that we experiment. What's bad is when we experiment and we assume that our perspective is the only right one. Nietzsche thinks that it's clearly obvious that the perspectives are just perspectives, right? That it's just a framework to see the world as a Christian or a Muslim or an atheist. And once we start saying, no, atheism is the right only way, or Christianity is the only way to see it, that's when we're in error, and we're not appreciating reality as it is, in Nietzsche's view. Right? So it's okay to adopt perspectives, but we should appreciate they're just perspectives, he thinks. So what led us to nihilism to begin with? How did we get to the point as a culture where people started saying, there's no meaning to this life, there's no meaning to this anymore? This takes us back to the Aristotle's rational soul and Plato's rational soul. The idea that we as humans have this extra above and beyond ability to reason about moral behavior, that we know right from wrong. Nietzsche argues that ever since the scientific revolution, that idea that we can distinguish right from wrong, which is deeply connected to God, all of that has been chipped away gradually. And one of the many ways it has been done, Nietzsche said, is that we've discovered our place in the universe is much smaller and much more insignificant than we thought. Now, this is true whether you believe in God or not. It's very clear. We know that we are a planet, a small planet, revolving around a big star we call the sun. But that sun is one of many, many other stars in a huge, huge universe. One of millions of other stars just in the Milky Way galaxy. And there are hundreds of thousands of other galaxies with that many stars. That's pretty obscure, right? So in the Middle Ages, the Christian philosophers we looked at, up until the time of people like Copernicus, before that they believed that we were the center of everything. That, like Aristotle believed, we were a centrally located creation of God. Aristotle didn't believe in God in that way, but Aristotle did believe we were the center. So that was the worldview we had. God was everything. We were the center of the universe. Now imagine the shift from being the center of the universe to not only not being the center, but being a tiny, insignificant speck next to the entire planet of the Earth is a tiny, insignificant speck next to how huge the rest of the universe is, right? It's really quite overwhelming. And so Nietzsche says, and you can see that process in these pictures. The only picture there that's fictional, or that's is the solar system. That's an actual image of the galaxy, and then the one on the right is an image of many galaxies. And so this is the universe that we live in. So we don't seem to be that important. And Nietzsche says, when discoveries like this come about, it's not immediate, it's not direct, but when people hear this, even if they reject it, and many people rejected these discoveries for years, as they still continue to do, it's still chipping away though, right? It's still gradually chipping away. They might say, oh, I'm not going to believe that. But deep in the back of their mind, they're thinking, at least subconsciously, wow, okay, that makes sense. Scientists have discovered this, right? It's hard to really, truly deny the discoveries of science, especially ones like this, where we have images from space and NASA that help us understand our universe. So new scientific discoveries, Nietzsche says, are chipping away at our belief in God, which is then causing the Jenga piece to fall out, so that our whole moral system comes crashing down and it takes us into the stage of nihilism. Nietzsche doesn't say this happens overnight. It's very gradual. Some people move away from God more quickly than others. Other people cling or stick to the idea of God. And Nietzsche actually calls these weak people versus strong people. He says weak people are those who can't handle that God is dying. And so, kind of like a kid who is scared to leave his mother, he clings to God and says, no, I still believe, even though deep down his faith is being eroded and being chipped away. Kind of like a piece of driftwood on the beach where the ocean, the tide comes in and gradually washes it away. And if you're going every day, you don't even notice that it's actually depleting. That's kind of what Nietzsche says metaphorically is happening to our collective belief in God. It's gradually getting eroded and chipped away as we discover more and more new things. And he says the weak people are actually resentful. He says they're resentful of the strong people who are able to push away the belief and move on with their lives and move to the next stage. Weak people will cling to the belief in God and double down on it and say, yeah, I believe even more now, all according to Nietzsche. So there's an example I have in the reader of a kid who, I want to say he was 14 or 15, and he had two parents who were very religiously devout, and they did not believe much in Western science or in Western medicine. And their son had appendicitis, right, where you need to get your appendix removed. This is an operation that we fully understand now, and I just had a friend a year ago or so had appendicitis, got the appendix removed, and she's perfectly fine. But if you don't do it, you'll die, right? So this is a case where God isn't going to help you. You need to go to the doctor, right? It's not a case where prayer is going to help. But that's exactly what these parents said. They said, well, God will save you, and they prayed for him, and their son died. Right? So that's an example of the religion and science coming together, where Nietzsche is saying science has overtaken religion, but this is the case where these people were, Nietzsche would call them weak. They were still holding on to that belief in God. They weren't willing to move past and let the scientific evidence guide their life. So anyways, that's an example of how tapered this process is. It's not a clean, linear process. Gradually, more and more people will come to believe less and less in God, all according to Nietzsche, chipping away at that original belief. So there's a movie that overall, I wouldn't say it's the greatest movie, but it was kind of a cool B movie, and it's probably been 10 years or so now since it was out. It's called The Last Exorcist, or The Last Exorcism, and it's kind of a B horror movie, but one of the plot lines is that there's this one of these guys who, an exorcist, who goes around to people's houses, and he pretends that they have demons or something in their house, by attaching like a device to their bed that makes it shake, and then he goes in and he pretends to exorcise the demon. And a central theme of the movie is about his faith. And he actually mentions at one point, and it's produced like a mockumentary, so they're interviewing the guy, and then he'll go and do something. And so they interview him, And he says that, well, yeah, I've been doing this for years, but I lost my faith like 7 or 8 years ago. So he's going around telling people he believes in God, doing exorcisms, all the while he's an atheist. And this is something else that Nietzsche says. Right, because a response you might have to Nietzsche is, oh, well, God's not dying. There are still plenty of people around the world who believe in God. That's the counter-argument to Nietzsche. There's still plenty of people who believe. And that's true, but Nietzsche would say, yeah, but a lot of them, they're just going through the motions. Their faith is empty, he would say. They don't really have faith. They'll say it in front of other people because they know there are social consequences to not admitting that there's no God, but deep down they don't believe. I mean, think of the consequences of when you have and I'm sure some of you know this, I mean, I know it to some degree, when you have a family that's deeply religious and you go to the dinner table, and everyone's saying prayers, I mean, and if you really don't believe, you've stopped believing, how hard is that to really let your family know? I mean, you're going to disappoint your grandma and your parents. That's a tough situation. And that's why Nietzsche says, for a lot of people, they did stop believing. Their faith is empty, but they're not able to express it because they don't want to disappoint everyone around them. And so in other words, it's not a counter-argument to Nietzsche to say many people believe in God, because Nietzsche says, yeah, but how do you know they really believe? How do you know they're not just going through the motions? So that's the death of God. So let me just add one more piece of the puzzle here, which is that as technology advances, we are able to explain things in a new way that were once explained by God. And one way you can see this is that if you even took something like just an everyday 7-Eleven lighter, and you went back, like 700-800 years in time, if there was some, we had the amazing ability of a time machine, if you went back in time with that lighter, you'd probably be seen as a wizard by some people. Well, you can create fire out of your fingers like that. I mean, it would be incredible. So as we advance technologically, we start explaining things that were once explained by God. And this happened very, very specifically and very messily with the Catholic Church versus people like Copernicus and Galileo, who said, hey, we're no longer at the center. I have these observations in my telescope that say the sun is this thing we're revolving around. And there was a huge struggle for power there, where the Catholic Church said, no, how dare you question Aristotle and our view? And but guess who won eventually? Science did. And today, the Catholic Church is no longer arguing that we're the center of the universe. Right? So as we advance scientifically, the new ideas we discover, the new discoveries often push out religious values that we had before. So that's another way that driftwood is getting eroded, right? It's not just leading us to collapse our moral values, but it's actually changing our beliefs about reality. So another example is evolution. It's one of the central reason people oppose evolution, if they still do today, is because they believe God created us, right? Evolution impinges upon what God supposedly did. That's exactly what Nietzsche is talking about. People before Darwin believed that, in the West mostly, that God created us the way we are. But evolution says, well, actually, the way we came to be what we are is through this very natural, incredibly complex and lengthy process called evolution. That's how we came to be how we are. And that clashes with the idea that God created us as we are, at least on its face. And so that's an example of how scientific discoveries are eroding that need to believe. And what's even crazier is that today, scientists are discovering that we have moral roots in our behavior, that morality can be explained in some ways. Some aspects of morality can be explained through scientific observation and reason. And not only that, but ape societies and gorillas and monkeys and whatnot seem to have some basic level of moral behavior that seems to be more advanced in us. Right, so these are all ways that new scientific discoveries are impinging upon what religion used to explain. And of course, the Big Bang is another example, right? That if God created the universe, well, was it the Big Bang? Did God start the Big Bang? Right. Now some of this comes down to how you define the difference between religion and science. Right? So some people argue that there's a phrase called from this guy Stephen Jay Gould that was called, I think it was Gould. It's called non-overlapping magisteria, meaning there's two realms that don't go together. So he argued that reason and science could not go together. Nietzsche argues that they can. But there do seem to be cases where one impinges upon the other. Again, the example of the Catholic Church and the example of the appendicitis. So anyways, Nietzsche, let me just sum it up. Nietzsche's saying that the idea of God is being killed in our minds. It's not dead yet, but it's dying. And he would say today it's continuing to die. The more we discover, the more we learn about our world, the less need we have to explain things with religious values and meaning and God per se, which for Nietzsche allows us to advance to the next stage. And just so you can see it in his own words, and by the way, if you're interested in Nietzsche's work, I highly recommend Beyond Good and Evil, a great place to start, that emphasizes a lot of these ideas I'm talking to you about today. So Nietzsche says, perhaps the day will come when concepts of God and sin, which are the most solemn concepts of all and have caused the most fighting and suffering, will seem no more important to us than a child's toy and a child's pain seem to an old man. This is the future that Nietzsche envisions. He sees a time when we look back on our beliefs now with the same sort of quaint view that we look back today on previous beliefs. So for example, can you imagine if a senator in the United States Senate went in and instead of swearing his hand on a Bible, he took out a book of Greek mythology and said, I want to give this up for Poseidon, god of the sea? He would get laughed off the stage. And yet, what's the difference between Poseidon and Zeus and God of the Bible or God of the Quran? Nietzsche would say there's no difference. They're both just mythology in his view. So in the same way we look back and laugh at the fact that people believed in Zeus, people in the future might look back at us and laugh at the fact that we believed in God at all, right? And that's the crucial thing to see. And it's hard for us to see outside of our historical circumstance because, of course, people in the Greek times, they didn't think it was silly to believe in Zeus, right? They would have, if you didn't believe in Zeus, they probably thought you were weird in a lot of cases. But now we look back and say, how silly. Nietzsche says, maybe we're going to look back at the whole idea of God and sin in the same way and think it was silly. And Nietzsche thinks that that's a good thing because he thinks that these ideas, as you can see in that quote, are causing a lot of suffering and problems in society, and we need to get rid of them. So this chipping away at God, Nietzsche sees, and at all religious values is a necessary process for us to move on to the next level, for us to advance to the next stage of humanity. And by the way, the meaning of that book title, Beyond Good and Evil, is just that. It's the idea of moving humans beyond the ideas we've previously had of good and evil. It's moving humans to the next stage beyond our primitive conception of sin and salvation and, going to heaven and going to hell. Nietzsche thinks those are primitive beliefs that are holding us back that need to be chipped away. And so he's happy that they're gradually being chipped away. Where does this all lead us? Well, it leads us to that Ubermensch stage, to that next advancement of humanity. And Nietzsche thinks we can't get there until we have discarded the old stuff and until the driftwood is completely erased. We can't really fully advance. But Nietzsche considers himself a prophet because he sees a time when we will advance this way, when humans will rise up and they'll stop using traditional appeals and they'll stop just following the same religion and the same beliefs as their parents. And we'll work together to create a better world. We'll work together to create this new, higher evolved person, higher evolved human. And this is, again, I want to emphasize, this is the overcoming of good and evil, moving beyond. It's transcending good and evil. It's not creating a new good and evil, it's transcending the entire systems that we've had before to a whole new way of looking at the world. And this is the overman. This is the superman. Sometimes it's translated as superman. It's the Ubermensch, right? Moving beyond morality itself. So a number of questions arise here about the Ubermensch. So if all values have been erased, if the Jenga piece has shattered on the ground, the Jenga puzzle is shattered on the ground, and our values are just strewn about, and we don't know what to do, will that just lead to pure chaos? Will that just lead all hell to break loose? Or will it lead us to have a temporary stage of chaos, and then as people become more advanced and have more strength, will we be able to build together as over men and over women a new society where we're all sort of on an equal footing? Nobody knows, and Nietzsche hints that it would be the latter. But he doesn't. Like I said, he admitted himself that he was a prophet here. He didn't know what would come next. He just saw a trend that something would come. Now, I like to think about this in terms of Frank Castle versus Jesus. I know that's a strange comparison, but if any of you have watched The Punisher, you know that Frank Castle is sort of this incredibly adept military guy who will, take anybody down, but he also has a very strong moral code for particular people that he sees as innocent and he sees as good. So would the overman, but at the same time, he kills a bunch of people. So would the overman be someone like him who thinks he's good but still goes around kind of behaving like a criminal because he thinks he's above everyone? Or would the overman actually be more somebody like Jesus? Would we all be like, Jesus? Would an overman actually lead us to be more compassionate? Is a more highly evolved, developed being, like we might say the Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad, are they just by nature more compassionate and more, because they're more advanced, does that lead them to have a greater appreciation for life and other people? And again, it's really an open question, because we certainly have not reached the stage of the Ubermensch yet, if we ever will reach it, that Nietzsche envisioned. Now, Nietzsche did have a couple of metrics for helping us think about what sort of values would the overman have. So if Nietzsche is telling us that the overman and then more evolved human creates his own values, what sorts of values would they be? And again, Nietzsche was a prophet, so he just made predictions. But because he loved art so much, he said, well, one thing is that a human would see, an overman would see his own life as a work of art. He would develop himself as though he's a canvas to be painted upon. He wouldn't think that he has some plan given to him by God or some plan from his family to become a doctor. He would see his life as an open canvas, and he would see himself as the sculpture to be created in different ways. That's why he would experiment with different perspectives and find ways to live artistically in whatever way that means for him. So that's one thing to think about, one value that might be in the overman. But Nietzsche gives us a thought experiment that he's not unique for creating this thought experiment. It's been part of other religious belief systems, including in, I believe, Hinduism and Buddhism. But it's this idea of eternal recurrence of the same. And so Nietzsche asks us to consider a thought experiment. Basically, imagine if you had to live your life over and over and over again for an infinite amount of times. And you would know each new time that you were living the same life, but you would have to live it in the same way, right? So you'd have an awareness that you had lived the life before, but you wouldn't have an ability to change it, right? So just go with that for the sake of the argument, for the sake of the thought experiment. What would you do? Right? Would you, in other words, would you be sad? Would you cry and wail and moan and bemoan your fate and say, why do I have to live this over and over? Would it be like playing a bad video game again and again and again? Or would you say, you know what? I love my life so much that I welcome living it again and again and again. I'll be in eternal paradise because my life is so good that it'll just repeat again and again and again. Now, Nietzsche said that a true overman, and he used a Latin phrase here to emphasize it, amor fati, love your fate. Nietzsche said a true overman would be someone who welcomes eternal recurrence, who wants to live his life over and over again. If you truly love your life, as an overman would, you would welcome eternal recurrence. So that reminds us that another value an overman would have is just pure joy at existence, right? Pure joy at being alive. Going back to Buddhism, some level of constant enlightenment, constant happiness at your own ability to be on this planet and to just be here at all. So, although we don't know specifically what would happen in the realm of an overman, we have some guesses, and Nietzsche had some guesses as well. So there's just one more idea I want to go into on Nietzsche. Like I mentioned, he was this thing that's called a philologist, who's someone who studies texts and tries to draw comparisons and differences and similarities and whatnot between these texts. And Nietzsche had read through probably most of the religious texts in the world that were available to him at the time, and he recognizes that there are these two trends in morality. Now, let me first emphasize that Nietzsche is a perspectivist or relativist, as we talked about before. He does not believe that there are objective moral values. There are just values that are imposed by groups of people that are relative to those groups, the Christian values and the Muslim values and the atheist values. Those are, again, going back to you put on the glasses, you have those values. They're not actually a structure or feature of the universe or world around us. It's just a perspective that we bring. So Nietzsche isn't saying, going back to slave and master morality, Nietzsche isn't saying these are objective moral features. He's saying these are two trends that humans have used over the years. So these would still be relative to the cultures. So Nietzsche's not contradicting himself here. He's not saying these values are objective. But he says that there are trends. And the trend that for most of history, Nietzsche argues, and certainly for the beginning of human history, was master morality. And this is, as you can see there, the morality of the strong, the morality of the nobles, the morality of those in charge. And the people in charge in early human societies were typically known to be fairly ruthless. And guess what? Because they were in charge, and because they had that power, their own behavior started defining what is virtuous, right? People wanted to be like them. They're the ones who set the standard because they were the ones with the power. So that standard that they set, which was one of dominance and power and overthrowing other nations and other people, that standard they set became the one that everyone else would follow. That was master morality, right? Because they were dominant, the values that the standard they set was one of dominance. So that's master morality. And as you can see, the virtues that they would have had would have been independent, they would have done what they wanted, they would have been creative in thinking about how to control and dominate a people and a group, and they would have been very honest. They would have said, you know what, I'm taking your land and you can't do anything about it, right? They wouldn't have lied and said, I'm doing this because it's in God's will or God's plan. They'd say, no, I'm taking it because I can take it. At least this is the way Nietzsche sees it. And indeed, when we look back at early cultures, I always think of a lesser-known culture, the Assyrians, not Syria today, but Assyria, 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 which was a very dominant culture in the 800 or 900 years before the Common Era, before the time of Jesus, and before the Roman Empire, before the Persian Empire. This was a very dominant empire, and it's even written about in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And they were known to subjugate the people that they conquered in terrible ways, slavery, killing people in front of their families, and they're setting the standards of morality, right? They're the ones setting that this is what's good. You want to be like the leader. You want to have that power. You want to have that strength. So anyways, morality was defined by the nobles for many years, according to Nietzsche. That all starts to change at the time of the Greeks. The Greeks are unique in the Western world in turning us away from just sheer dominance and into ideas like temperance and limits. And the Buddha would be included in this category too in the East. They took us away from that. They said, what's good is not strength and dominance over others. What's good is compassion and love and kindness towards others. What's good is being a part of a greater whole. Plato argued that one of the best functions you can serve is being part of the city, is serving your place in the city, right? So that's more of a sense of collectivism than individualism. So whereas before the standard for good was set by people like Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great, now you have that starting to shift a little bit, and actually is shifting during the time of Alexander the Great. You have that shift into more of a slave morality mentality, which is the second thing I'm describing here, where what is good is more the morality of the oppressed, the morality of people who don't have the strength. Right? It becomes good to help those in need rather than good to dominate them. So this shift, again, is not happening overnight. It's a gradual shift, and it's happening in different ways in different cultures, but it's happening for Nietzsche. And ultimately, it would lead to people like Jesus, whose morality today can be seen as slave morality, on down the line through Muhammad and others who represented this new way of understanding morality. Now, you might notice that they're still dominant. So Nietzsche actually, although he did not like religion and he argues against Christianity, he thought Jesus was a great man. He actually considered Jesus to be the last master moralist of the Christians. He said every other Christian was a follower of Jesus. They were just going along with him. But Jesus himself was a master moralist because he carved out this new way of doing things. But ironically, even though he was a master moralist, his followers are slave moralists because they just go with the crowd. Again, this is all according to Nietzsche. So anyways, this trend of slave morality starts to overtake master morality, ultimately leading to the religions we have today, like Buddhism and Christianity, that are based on peace and love for all and some level of obedience to certain principles or rules. And Nietzsche thought this started to happen with the Greeks, because look at what the Greeks do. They kind of say, well, what is right, what is good is to control yourself. It's not to just give in to your emotions and to give in to your desires for dominance. It's to use reason to control yourself. Plato envisions the human soul like a chariot that has two horses attached to it. And one horse is the will or the spirit, and the other is the emotions or the appetites. Those pull us away from the truth, said Plato. We need reason to reel us back in. We need that temperance, that control. And for Nietzsche, that process of curbing our natural desires, of limiting them, that is the beginning of slave morality, when we start to see that as good. And whereas before, the people in charge had been defined, their behavior was defined as good, like I said, the nobles. Now you have what is good being defined by people like Jesus and people like the Buddha. And again, this gradual shift occurs, and today, Nietzsche would say, we're square in the realm of slave morality, still. Now, Nietzsche thought slave morality was the morality of the weak. It was the morality of what he actually calls the underman. Not the overman, but the underman, the weaker person who does not advance himself or herself. And Nietzsche believed that when the overman came about, it was going to be a return to master morality, although he didn't necessarily say it would be dominance in the same way as like the Assyrians. But there would be a new type of strength where the values that were important to us were more about, that independence and that creativity, putting it back on the individual. And again, that raises questions that I raised before about what would that look like? Would it look like chaos, or would it look like some new, amazing, spiritually advanced society? Either way, like I also said, Nietzsche was a prophet, so he didn't know for sure. Okay, so I think that pretty much covers the core philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche.